I was born in 1966 in a very small town not far from Jerusalem. And this was just 7 months before the 1967 war that divided that country. The Palestinians and the Israelis both had blood and have blood on their hands. And at one point, the Israelis were the oppressors and the Palestinians were the oppressed. At another point, the Palestinians were the oppressors and the violent, and the Israelis received that violence. So how would you try to solve that conflict, keeping both sides happy?
It needs building up trust. And we come back to Francis and Kamil, this idea of trust. Trust one another. And if you want to work together with another person, you have to build up that trust.
This is a story about mutual respect and understanding, the kind that allows us to resolve conflict through dialogue. It's about the respect and understanding that developed between two men, one Christian, one Muslim. Jews, Christians, and Muslims have demonized one another through centuries of mutual suspicion. Inspired by the need to reverse that trend, we offer the story of Francis and the Sultan as a paradigm for peacemaking. We believe that when there is respect and openness on both sides, even enemies can begin to relate to one another. This very same story was once presented as a parable of Christian superiority. Each generation in Europe told it a little differently, until Franciscan artists of today began to see our own recent history reflected in the encounter.
I've been fascinated by the story of Francis and the Sultan since I first heard about it, because my family came from southern Russia. We have Turkish blood, and we weren't well received in the United States when we emigrated. And so the other has always been somebody in my life that I have related to more than mainstream America. And the thought that Francis had the courage to go to the Sultan and have a conversation with him when most of Europe wanted him dead was something that I could relate to.
Brother Robert decided, with the help of his Turkish Muslim friends in Houston, to express his own vision of the encounter.
We never had the advantage of a newspaper reporter following around behind St. Francis. Everything we know of St. Francis is basically myth, because it is the interpretation of things that people saw or heard from their point of view in their time. They interpreted those things in the light of values that they held dear and the values of their culture.
The few available details of Francis's trip to the Middle East come from Crusade historians who tell the story from the Christian point of view. That point of view is reinforced by Bonaventure of Bagnoregio, who was commissioned to write a revised version of the life of Francis some 40 years after Francis's death. The goal of the new text was to bring the image of the saint closer to what the Franciscan community needed: a church-approved founder. Introducing Francis's travels to the Levant, Bonaventure writes, "Francis, the intrepid knight of Christ, decided to make the journey, not terrified by the fear of death, but rather drawn by desire for it." Bonaventure is suggesting that Francis desires to be killed by the enemy in order to become a martyr. Now, who have we heard that about in recent years? Bonaventure's biography of Francis is eventually illustrated. These illustrations may not be as sophisticated as the cartoons and videos of today, but the techniques are all too familiar. The illustrator offers 3 images of the meeting between Francis and the Sultan. In the first, the 2 men are at the same level. The Sultan is center stage with his courtiers backing him up. In the second image, the sheep are a clear reference to the passage in the Christian scripture that speaks of the innocent lambs going among the wicked wolves. We see that God is helping Francis overpower the Sultan, who now shrinks under his canopy. The third image drives home the message of Christian superiority. Francis is center stage now, talking down to the Sultan, who seems to have been abandoned by his courtiers. Consider how these illustrations might have shaped the reader's understanding of what happened in Damietta. Even as the Franciscans build a grand basilica to honor their founder, they're aware of the need to appeal to ordinary people. On the interior walls, the life of Francis is presented in a popular style that Brother Robert calls vernacular art.
Most of the people of Europe were neglected as Christians. The rich had good clergy, the poor had whatever clergy were left over. They were sometimes not very well educated, sometimes they couldn't read, they had a few gospels memorized. The people were not being evangelized, and they were not being honored. Their existence in the church was not being honored. Part of what I am calling vernacular art is an attempt to bring into the churches things familiar to those people: the clothing they wore, the animals that they were herding in the fields, houses that they might have lived in. It was an attempt to bring the ordinary into sacred space, and also emotion, realism.
The best example is a tale that was added to the Damietta encounter. It had no historical basis, but it did capture the popular imagination.
Francis is pointing to a fire, which comes from a medieval legend that he offered to step into a fire to prove Christianity's strength. And these Sufis who have been challenged to step into the fire with Francis, there's a look of horror on their face, like, oh my God, we're not going to do that.
This kind of religious competition is contrary to everything we know about Francis. Yet Bonaventure's inclusion of the trial by fire made it the most commonly painted scene of the encounter for the next 400 years. While we can appreciate the desire of vernacular artists to appeal to the ordinary person, we have to ask ourselves, at what point do we recognize and resist the manipulation? To be fair, we must admit that the vilification of the enemy existed on both sides. Instead of pictures, the Muslim historians used words. Describing one of the many battles for Damietta, historian Ali ibn al-Athir says this about the Crusaders. When the Franks realized that they were completely surrounded, that death was snarling in their face, they lost heart and broke their crosses. Their devil had abandoned them. In the 19th century, Europe's colonialism is at its height. Finally, we begin to see a change in the European images depicting the encounter. The trial by fire is gone, but one has only to study the body language of the men to realize that the change is skin deep. Ultimately, these artists don't challenge the traditional idea of conversion. For that, we have to wait for an artist like Brother Robert, one who is willing to walk with Francis.
The conversion we're talking about is the type of conversion that Francis and the early friars were preaching. A changing of the world's values, where the people on the bottom were no longer left to starve, where people didn't have a surplus that they didn't need, where there was justice, where there was peace. I begin with myself, and I try to uproot from myself whatever is unjust and selfish and grasping about me.
When they met, Francis and the Sultan were already converts in this sense, but neither could have known that about the other.
I believe that within the first few hours in the tent of the Sultan, this confrontation between Islam and Christianity began to wear down. It may have been a day, it may have been 2 days, but eventually each man recognized that before him was another human being who already knew God in such a profound way that converting them to a different religion was superfluous. That you have each man recognizing in the other, as in a mirror, God. That you have Francis learning from the Sultan and the Sultan's people ways of devotion that people of Europe could learn and profit from. And you have in the Sultan recognition in this ragged little monk that not all Europeans are idolaters and bloodthirsty barbarians. In that sense, each of the men has been converted from a sense of the other as being enemy and evil to the sense that the other is a brother from whom you can learn something. I am absolutely certain that Francis did not hug the Sultan. One did not hug a sultan. An icon takes liberties that realistic art does not. So I am showing Francis perhaps meeting the Sultan in heaven, and the two of them embracing one another as kindred souls in a way that their culture would not have allowed when they were alive, face to face.
Brother Robert's icon of the Saint and the Sultan is actually the center panel of a triptych. And in the side panels, he challenges our preconceptions even further. In the right-hand panel, he uses the legend of the wolf that was terrorizing the town of Gubbio. Unarmed and alone, Francis walked outside the city walls to talk to the wolf about giving up its violent ways. As a result, the wolf stopped terrorizing the people. The people befriended and fed the wolf, and they lived together in peace for many years.
So here we have Francis with the wolf, but Francis as a fool. Francis taking two sticks one day and playing them as a violin. Part of the holiness that I see in both the life of the Sultan and Francis is a foolishness. When you're willing to stick your neck out, as Francis was with the wolf, as Francis was with a leper earlier in his life, at that point of foolishness, you open a door that the other can come through.
On the left panel is Fakhruddin al-Farisi, the Sultan's spiritual guide and also his ambassador to the West. After a decade of patient effort, this man finally brokered the Sultan's peace treaty with the Crusaders.
I have the Sufi seated on the ground, as a Sufi scholar would sit, holding the Quran in his hands, and next to him a falcon. It was this particular man who introduced falcon hunting into the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II. And so there's a historical reason to put the falcon next to him. But that's not enough reason in my mind to put the falcon there. You'll notice that there's a tether around the foot of the falcon. The falcon is not free to destroy at will. And this represents the teaching in the Quran about warfare. That warfare is permitted only under certain conditions, that non-combatants are to be spared, all of these things. It's what this man, as the ambassador of the Sultan and as his teacher, would have been insisting on. This is what you do in war.
In the work of artists like Brother Robert, the meeting between Francis and the Sultan is a meeting of equals. Nowhere is this more evident than in his representation of holiness.
There are different ways to make gold. This is 23 karat. But if you make it like 16 karat, it's almost white, like silver. And I thought that for a while I would make this 16 karat and this 23 karat, two different colors of gold. Color is the language of art, of this kind of art. And you have to decide what it is you're saying. The love between these two men who were in God, do I want to say that's different from the love of God? And I said, no, it's the same love. The Christian halo is a round circle. And in Persian art in particular, flames surround a holy person's head. I have Francis and the Wolf of Gubbio, and around his head is simply a round halo. When I painted Fakhruddin al-Farisi, the Sufi advisor, I simply put around his head the flames. But in the center panel, you have the flames and the round circles, and they're made out of the same gold leaf, which is an artist's way of saying that there is one holiness, although it may be expressed in different cultural ways, and that these two types of halo made out of the same gold leaf show the oneness that they had in coming together in God. From what I know of Islamic aesthetics, a mosque recreates paradise. So on the floors are these floral carpets which show the flowers of paradise, and the light that comes into the dome, and then the great emptiness with no images. God is in that emptiness because God is inexpressible. I think that that is ultimately also true of a Byzantine icon, that God is on the other side of the icon.
At the time of the Byzantine Empire, Hagia Sophia was a cathedral. It was converted to a mosque under the Ottoman Empire. Fortunately, the art of both religions has been preserved.
You know, it's one thing to tell a story that feeds the mind, and maybe that feeding of the mind will reach the heart. It may take you a few feet down the wisdom path, but our wisdom path, whether it be in Islam, whether it be in Christianity, whether it be in the Hindu religion, Buddhism, ultimately leads us to mystical union with God. And for that you need an art that has transcendence. The heroes in the myths, the saints in the saint stories, all that pertains to idealism, if we didn't have that, we would indeed sink into the horrible puddle of mud. These stories keep alive for us the hope that there could be a spark that could fan into a flame that could make the world better. And so artists, poets, storytellers, preachers, we try to keep bringing these heroes before people's eyes. Muslims would say most of us are subhuman because we don't realize our capacity. Maybe it is an effort to simply try to elevate us to being fully human, which is to go beyond our cultures and our prejudices and our fears.
Interreligious dialogue may start with the church or the mosque. It may start with studying a verse in the Quran and a verse in the Bible, but it has to end in the field where Christians and Muslims come together, rolling up their sleeves to take care of a shelter, a homeless shelter, to take care of a project that will give food to the hungry.
The good neighborly relations, that is dialogue as well. You don't need to be a scholar to do that. But we do need the scholars too, to understand the different traditions and where there is possibility of conflict, but where there is also a possibility of cooperation.